What if I told you that one of the most powerful companies in history started because two young friends took a risk on a computer they had never even touched? It sounds unbelievable, but that's exactly what happened. Before Microsoft became a company worth hundreds of billions of dollars, before Windows appeared on billions of computers, before Bill Gates became one of the richest people on Earth, he was just another teenager spending countless hours learning something that most people considered completely useless. Here's an English expression you'll hear native speakers use quite often: ahead of his time. If someone is ahead of their time, it means they see opportunities or ideas long before everyone else does. And if there was ever someone who perfectly matched that expression, it was Bill Gates. But here's something even more surprising. Most people think Bill Gates became successful because he was a genius. That's only part of the story. Many intelligent people never build extraordinary companies. Many talented programmers never change the world. So what made Bill Gates different? Was it intelligence? Hard work? Luck? Or was it the way he recognized opportunities that everyone else overlooked? Today, we're going to answer those questions. You'll discover how a curious teenager became the co-founder of Microsoft, how one business decision completely changed the computer industry, why his vision transformed the way billions of people work and communicate, and what his journey can teach us about success, discipline, learning, and thinking differently. And while you enjoy the story, you'll naturally improve your English listening skills by learning useful business and technology vocabulary exactly the way native speakers use it. For example, throughout today's lesson, you'll hear words like startup, innovation, software, entrepreneur, vision, and opportunity. Don't worry if you don't know every word yet. You'll understand them naturally through the story, because that's one of the fastest ways to build real English fluency. Not by memorizing long vocabulary lists, but by hearing useful English in meaningful, memorable situations. So, let's travel back to Seattle in the 1960s, where one curious boy was about to discover a machine that would completely change his life, and eventually, the entire world. Lesson number 1: Why the brain keeps asking for more. Picture this. Someone decides to stop watching pornography. They feel serious about it. They delete certain accounts, promise themselves they'll change, and maybe even succeed for several days. Then stress arrives, or boredom, or loneliness, and suddenly the urge returns. The person may think, "Why am I doing this again? Why can't I just control myself?" That question often creates shame. But shame doesn't explain the behavior. To understand what's happening, we need to look at the brain's reward system. Here's a useful English expression: caught in a loop. When someone is caught in a loop, they keep repeating the same pattern even though they want to stop. Compulsive pornography use often develops through a loop with 3 basic stages: a trigger, a behavior, and a reward. The trigger may be stress, boredom, loneliness, frustration, or simply being alone with a phone late at night. The behavior is the action the person has learned to use. The reward is a temporary feeling of stimulation, escape, or relief. Notice that word, temporary. The behavior may reduce discomfort for a short time, but it doesn't solve the real problem underneath. The stress remains. The loneliness remains. The boredom eventually returns. So the brain learns, when I feel uncomfortable, this is how I escape. That is how a habit becomes stronger. Now, people often hear the word dopamine and assume it simply means pleasure. But that explanation is incomplete. Dopamine is strongly connected to anticipation, motivation, and learning. It helps the brain remember which behaviors might lead to a reward. In simple language, dopamine doesn't only say, "This feels good." It also says, "Remember this, look for it again." And digital content can make this learning process especially powerful because it offers constant novelty. A new image, a new video, a new choice. The brain is naturally attracted to novelty because new information may represent a new reward. That means anticipation itself can become part of the habit. Sometimes the strongest pull appears before the person even watches anything. It begins while scrolling, searching, or imagining what might appear next. This helps explain why telling yourself to just use more willpower often fails. Willpower is useful, but it becomes weaker when you're tired, stressed, emotionally upset, or surrounded by familiar triggers. That doesn't mean change is impossible. It means the strategy must be smarter. Here's another valuable English phrase: break the pattern. To break a pattern means to interrupt a repeated behavior before it continues automatically. The first step is not fighting the urge with panic. It is learning to identify what usually happens before it. Ask yourself, what was I feeling 5 minutes before the urge appeared? Was it boredom, stress, rejection, anxiety, tiredness? The visible behavior is often not the beginning of the problem. It is the final step in a chain. Imagine someone who regularly struggles late at night. They may think the problem begins when they open a website, but the real pattern may begin much earlier. They stay awake while tired. They take their phone into bed. They start scrolling without a purpose. They feel lonely or restless. Then the urge becomes stronger. By focusing only on the final action, they ignore the earlier decisions that made it more likely. This is why recovery often begins with changing the environment, not because the environment controls everything, but because it affects how many decisions you must fight. Leaving the phone outside the bedroom, sleeping at a regular time, avoiding aimless late-night scrolling, planning something useful during predictable periods of boredom. These actions may seem simple, but simple does not mean weak. Good systems reduce the number of moments in which willpower must rescue you. And here is the most important idea in this lesson. An urge is not an order. It is a temporary mental and physical experience. It rises, it becomes intense, then, if you do not immediately feed it, it can fall again. Many people assume an urge will keep growing forever until they obey it. Usually, it behaves more like a wave. It builds, reaches a peak, and eventually passes. Learning to wait, move to another room, take a walk, speak to someone trustworthy, or begin a prepared activity can create enough distance for the wave to weaken. The goal is not to become a person who never experiences temptation. The goal is to become someone who recognizes the loop early and knows how to interrupt it. Because once you understand the pattern, the behavior stops looking mysterious. And when something is no longer mysterious, it becomes much easier to change. Lesson number 2: why shame makes the habit stronger and what actually helps instead. Imagine someone who has just broken a promise they made to themselves. They sit alone and think, I can't believe I did it again. What's wrong with me? I'll never change. If you've ever struggled with a habit, whether it was procrastination, overeating, spending too much time on social media, or compulsive pornography use, you may recognize that inner voice. Here's an English expression you'll hear native speakers use: to beat yourself up. It doesn't mean physically hitting yourself. It means being extremely harsh and critical toward yourself after making a mistake. For example, don't beat yourself up. Everyone makes mistakes. This expression is very common in everyday English. Now, here's something surprising that many people don't know. Most people believe that feeling ashamed after a relapse will motivate them to stop. It sounds logical. If I feel bad enough, I'll never do it again. But psychology tells a different story. In many cases, shame actually strengthens the cycle. Let's see why. Imagine your brain as a student. Every time you're stressed, lonely, or overwhelmed, it looks for the fastest way to feel better. If pornography has become that escape, your brain starts building a shortcut. Stress equals pornography. Loneliness equals pornography. Boredom equals pornography. Now imagine what happens after a relapse. Instead of saying, "I made a mistake, let me understand what happened," the person says, "I'm weak. I'm hopeless. I'll never change." Those thoughts create even more painful emotions. And what has the brain learned to use whenever painful emotions appear? The same habit. Do you see the trap? The shame becomes another trigger. This is why many psychologists encourage people to replace self-judgment with self-awareness. Notice the difference. Self-judgment asks, "What's wrong with me?" Self-awareness asks, "What happened just before I made that decision?" One question attacks your identity. The other helps you understand your behavior. And understanding behavior is what leads to lasting change. Let's imagine two different people. Both experience a relapse. The first person says, "I've failed. I might as well give up." The second person says, "Something triggered me today. I need to figure out what it was." Who do you think has a better chance of improving? Almost always, it's the second person. Not because they're stronger, but because they're learning instead of judging. Here's another useful English phrase: get back on track. Native speakers use this when someone returns to a good habit after a setback. For example, "I missed 2 days at the gym, but I'm back on track now." That's exactly the mindset recovery requires. One mistake doesn't erase your progress. Think about learning English. Suppose you've studied consistently for 3 months. Then life becomes busy and you don't study for a week. Would you say, "Well, I guess I'll never become fluent"? Of course not. You would simply start again. Yet many people don't treat other habits with the same kindness. They believe one setback means the entire journey is over. But progress has never been about perfection. It's about direction. Another important lesson is this: your identity is not your habit. Someone who struggles with a compulsive behavior is not defined by that behavior. You're not your worst day. You're not your biggest mistake. You're not the thought that crossed your mind this morning. You're the person who chooses what to do next. That distinction matters, because when people label themselves, "I'm broken," "I'm hopeless," "I'm an addict forever," they often begin acting in ways that match that identity. Instead, try saying, "I'm someone who's learning healthier habits." That small change in language may seem simple, but language shapes belief, and belief shapes behavior. Before we finish this lesson, here's a practical strategy you can start using today. The next time you experience a setback, don't immediately ask, "Why did I fail?" Instead, ask these 3 questions. What was I feeling? What triggered the urge? What can I do differently next time? Those 3 questions turn a mistake into a lesson, and every lesson makes you stronger. Because real recovery isn't built on guilt, it's built on understanding. The more clearly you understand your patterns, the less power those patterns have over your future. And that's where genuine change begins. Lesson number 3. The hidden triggers that most people never notice. Imagine someone says, "It just happened. I don't even know why. One minute I was fine, and the next minute I found myself doing it again." Many people genuinely believe their behavior appears out of nowhere. But if we could rewind the previous 30 minutes or even the previous few hours, we would often discover a completely different story. Here's an English expression native speakers use. the last straw. It doesn't mean an actual straw. It describes the final small event that causes someone to react after many other problems have already built up. For example, losing my keys wasn't the real problem. It was just the last straw after a stressful day. Compulsive behaviors often work the same way. The urge isn't usually created by one single moment. It's the last step in a chain that started much earlier. Let's imagine a normal day. You wake up tired because you slept only 5 hours. You skip breakfast. Work or school feels stressful. Someone criticizes you. You spend hours scrolling on social media. You compare yourself to other people. By evening, your brain feels mentally exhausted. Then you're alone. Your phone is beside you. Suddenly, the urge feels incredibly strong. Was the phone the real trigger? Not entirely. The phone was simply the final door. The real triggers began hours before. This is one reason psychologists often encourage people to become detectives rather than judges. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" ask, "What happened before this?" That single question changes everything. Because once you discover the pattern, you can begin changing it. Here's another useful English phrase: connect the dots. It means to understand how different events are related. For example, after writing everything down for a week, I finally connected the dots. That's exactly what many people experience. At first, the habit seems random. Then they notice something surprising. Almost every relapse happened after a poor night's sleep, or after an argument, or during periods of loneliness, or after spending hours online with no purpose. The pattern suddenly becomes clear. Now here's something fascinating about the brain. Your brain loves efficiency. Whenever you repeat the same behavior in the same situation, your brain begins creating an automatic pathway. Think about driving home. Have you ever arrived home and realized you barely remembered the drive? That's because your brain had already learned the route. Habits work in a very similar way. The more often you repeat them, the less conscious effort they require. This is why people sometimes say, "I wasn't even thinking." In reality, their brain was following a familiar path. But here's the good news. If the brain can learn unhealthy patterns, it can also learn healthier ones. That's called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity simply means your brain can change throughout your life. Every healthy decision strengthens new pathways. Every time you interrupt an old habit, you're teaching your brain a different response. Not instantly, not overnight, but gradually. Let's bring this back to English learning for a moment. Imagine you've always translated every English sentence into your native language before speaking. At first, it feels automatic. Your brain has practiced that pathway for years. But if you consistently practice thinking directly in English, something amazing begins to happen. The old habit becomes weaker. The new habit becomes stronger. Your brain adapts. The same principle applies to almost every habit in life. Now here's an exercise that psychologists often recommend. For 1 week, don't focus only on whether you succeeded or failed. Instead, become curious. Write down 4 simple things whenever you notice a strong urge. Where am I? What am I feeling? What happened during the last hour? What do I actually need right now? You may discover something surprising. Perhaps what you needed wasn't stimulation. Perhaps you needed rest, connection, movement, fresh air, a conversation, or simply a break from stress. Many urges are actually disguised needs. The behavior becomes a shortcut, but shortcuts rarely solve the original problem. Here's another important idea. Many people spend all their energy fighting temptation. Very few spend time removing unnecessary temptation. Imagine putting a bowl of candy on your desk while trying to eat healthier. Would that make success easier? Probably not. The environment matters. The same is true here. Small changes, like leaving your phone outside your bedroom, blocking certain websites, creating a consistent evening routine, or replacing idle scrolling with a planned activity, can dramatically reduce the number of moments when you're forced to rely on willpower alone. Strong habits don't happen by accident. They are designed, and healthier lives are often built the same way. So before blaming yourself the next time you struggle, pause. Look backward instead of forward. Because hidden behind almost every difficult habit, there's usually a trigger waiting to be discovered. And once you discover it, you've already taken one of the biggest steps toward lasting change. Lesson number 4. Why willpower alone isn't enough, and what works better instead. Imagine two people. Both decide that tonight will be different. Both are motivated. Both genuinely want to change. The first person says, "I'll just rely on my willpower." The second person says, "I'm going to make this decision easier before the temptation even appears." A month later, which person is more likely to succeed? Most people would answer, the one with more self-control. But psychology gives us a different answer. The person who built a better system usually wins. Here's an English expression you'll hear native speakers use. Set yourself up for success. It means to prepare your environment so that making the right decision becomes easier. For example, I leave my running shoes by the door because it sets me up for success. That's exactly how lasting change works. Many people believe successful people simply have stronger willpower. In reality, they often make fewer decisions that require willpower. Think about this. Have you ever gone grocery shopping while you were hungry? Everything suddenly looks delicious. Foods you normally ignore become incredibly tempting. Now, compare that to shopping after you've eaten a healthy meal. The supermarket hasn't changed. Your brain has. Willpower changes throughout the day. Research suggests that when we're tired, stressed, overwhelmed, or mentally exhausted, resisting temptation becomes much harder. That doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. Here's something fascinating. Every day, your brain makes thousands of decisions. What should I wear? What should I eat? Should I answer this message now? Should I finish this task later? By the evening, your mental energy is often lower than it was in the morning. That's one reason many unhealthy habits happen late at night. Not because people suddenly become different, but because they're mentally exhausted. Now imagine someone who always struggles after midnight. They tell themselves, "Tonight I'll be stronger." But they still stay awake. They still take their phone to bed. They still scroll aimlessly. Eventually, temptation appears. Now they're asking willpower to fight a battle they could have avoided entirely. Successful change usually begins much earlier, not at midnight, but at 10 o'clock, or even that morning. This brings us to another useful English expression: remove the temptation. Native speakers often say, the easiest way to avoid temptation is to remove it. It's simple advice, but incredibly powerful. Suppose you're trying to reduce your screen time. Would it be easier if distracting apps were one tap away, or if they were deleted? Suppose you're trying to eat healthier. Would it be easier if unhealthy snacks were sitting on your desk, or if your kitchen was stocked with healthier choices? Your environment quietly influences your decisions every single day. Psychologists sometimes describe this as designing your environment instead of constantly fighting it. Instead of asking, "How can I become stronger?" ask, "How can I make the unhealthy choice more difficult and the healthy choice easier?" That question changes everything. Let's connect this idea to English learning. Many learners say, I don't have enough motivation to study. But what happens if your English book is already on your desk? Your headphones are charged, your lesson is ready. You've planned exactly 20 minutes. Now, studying requires much less effort. You've reduced friction. The same principle applies to breaking unhealthy habits. Reduce the friction for good habits. Increase the friction for harmful ones. Here's another important lesson. Don't try to replace a habit with nothing. The brain dislikes empty spaces. If someone spends an hour every evening watching pornography and suddenly removes that behavior completely, what fills that hour? If the answer is nothing, the old habit often returns. That's why experts recommend replacing unhealthy routines with meaningful alternatives. Exercise, reading, learning English, talking to a friend, journaling, working on a personal project, going for a walk. The goal isn't simply to remove something, it's to build a life that gradually makes the old habit less attractive. And here's perhaps the biggest mistake people make. They expect one perfect day. They tell themselves, from tomorrow, I'll never struggle again. But recovery rarely looks like that. Real progress is usually quiet. One better decision today, another tomorrow. A setback, a lesson, another improvement. Over time, those small choices begin changing the brain itself. Remember the word we learned earlier? Neuroplasticity. Your brain is constantly adapting to what you repeatedly do. Every healthy choice strengthens a new pathway. Every time you interrupt an old routine, you're teaching your brain a different future. Little by little, the healthier choice begins feeling more natural. Not because your life suddenly became easy, but because your brain learned a new pattern. And that's the truth many people never hear. Recovery isn't a battle won by one heroic moment of willpower. It's a process built through smart systems, healthy environments, consistent routines, and small decisions repeated every single day. Because when you stop depending only on motivation and start designing your life for success, lasting change becomes far more achievable. Lesson number 5. How to rebuild your confidence after setbacks and create lasting freedom. Let's imagine two people. Both have been making progress for several weeks. They've built healthier routines, they feel more confident. Then one day, they experience a relapse. The first person says, "That's it, I've ruined everything. I knew I couldn't do it. I'll just start again next month." The second person says, "I'm disappointed, but one mistake doesn't erase the progress I've already made. Let me understand what happened so I can avoid it next time." 1 month later, their lives look completely different. Not because one person had more intelligence, not because one had stronger willpower, but because they interpreted the setback differently. Here's a useful English expression: get back on your feet. Native speakers use this expression when someone recovers after a difficult situation. For example, she lost her job, but she got back on her feet within a few months. Recovery isn't about never falling. It's about learning how quickly you can stand up again. And that's something many people misunderstand. They think success means perfection. But perfection doesn't exist. Not in learning English, not in building a business, not in becoming healthier, and not in overcoming an addiction. Progress has never been a straight line. Think about a child learning to walk. They don't stand up once and suddenly walk perfectly forever. They fall. Again, and again, and again. Yet no parent watches a child fall and says, "Well, I guess walking just isn't for you." Of course not. Because everyone understands that falling is part of learning. Strangely, adults often forget this lesson. The moment they make one mistake, they believe they've failed completely. Psychologists call this the all-or-nothing mindset. It's the belief that if something isn't perfect, it's worthless. For example, I missed one workout, so my fitness plan is ruined. I ate one unhealthy meal, so I might as well keep eating junk food. I missed one day of studying English, so I'll start again next month. Can you see the problem? One small mistake becomes an excuse to stop completely. But emotionally resilient people think differently. Instead of asking, "Did I fail?" they ask, "What did this experience teach me?" That simple question changes failure into feedback, and feedback leads to improvement. Here's another English expression you'll hear often: one step at a time. It means focusing on the next small action instead of worrying about the entire journey. Imagine standing at the bottom of a mountain. If you keep looking only at the top, the climb feels impossible. But if you focus on the very next step, you eventually reach the summit. Recovery works exactly the same way. Don't ask, "How will I stay free forever?" Ask, "What's the healthiest decision I can make during the next 10 minutes?" That's a question your brain can actually answer. Now here's something fascinating. Researchers have found that people who practice self-compassion after setbacks are often more likely to recover than those who constantly criticize themselves. At first, that sounds strange. Wouldn't being strict create better discipline? Not necessarily. Imagine having two coaches. The first coach screams every time you make a mistake, "You're terrible! You'll never improve!" The second coach says, "That wasn't your best performance. Let's figure out what happened and improve tomorrow." Which coach would you rather have? Most people choose the second. So why not become that coach for yourself? Being compassionate doesn't mean making excuses. It means telling yourself the truth without attacking your own worth. You can say, "I made a poor decision today," without saying, "I'm a failure." Those are completely different statements. One describes behavior, the other attacks identity. Never confuse the two. Let's connect this to English learning one last time. Imagine you've been speaking English for 6 months. One day, you forget simple words during a conversation. Does that mean you've lost everything you've learned? Of course not. It simply means you had a difficult day. The same is true for any habit you're trying to change. One difficult day does not erase months of progress. The brain doesn't learn in giant leaps. It learns through repetition. Every healthy decision, every honest reflection, every moment you choose growth instead of giving up, strengthens the person you're becoming. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Freedom isn't created by one perfect decision. It's created by thousands of ordinary decisions, made consistently, especially on the days when nobody is watching. If you're struggling today, remember this: your past explains you. It does not define you. Your mistakes teach you. They do not own you. And your future will not be determined by the worst day of your life, but by the decision you make after it. So be patient with yourself. Stay curious. Keep learning. Keep improving. One step, one lesson, and one day at a time. Because lasting freedom isn't about becoming a perfect person, it's about becoming a wiser one. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope this lesson helped you improve not only your English, but also your understanding of how habits are formed and how meaningful change happens. Remember, every healthy choice you make, no matter how small, is a step toward becoming the person you want to be. Keep learning, keep growing, and I'll see you in the next lesson.